Have you ever wondered what drives a man to return to the same grave every single day, rain or shine, with a bouquet of fresh flowers in his trembling hands? What kind of sorrow could carve such a deep scar into someone's soul that they're bound to a ritual of grief? And what happens when a simple question from an innocent child cracks open a wound that's been festering for years? In the heart of a quiet, small-town cemetery in upstate New York, where the autumn leaves fall like whispers of forgotten stories and the air carries the faint chill of early November, there's a man who's become a silent fixture among the headstones. His name is James "Jimmy" Carter, a weathered soul in his late 60s, with hands calloused from decades of hard labor, and eyes that seem to look right through the world, as if they're searching for something or someone long gone. Every morning, as the sun paints the Hudson Valley in hues of amber and gold, Jimmy trudges down the winding dirt path of Willowbrook Cemetery, his old work boots crunching against the frost-kissed gravel. He wears a faded flannel jacket, the kind you'd expect on a man who's spent his life working the land or hauling freight down Route 9, and a navy cap pulled low over his brow, shielding his face from curious glances. In his left hand, always, is a modest bundle of flowers, daisies mostly, sometimes wildflowers he picks from the roadside on his way. They're wrapped in butcher paper, tied with a piece of twine, as if each bouquet is a fragile offering to a memory he can't let go of. Jimmy doesn't speak much to anyone, not even to Miss Clara, the elderly caretaker who sweeps the fallen leaves from the cemetery paths and offers him a kind nod each morning. He just walks with a slow, deliberate gait, his shoulders hunched under an invisible weight, until he reaches the same grave, tucked under the gnarled branches of an ancient oak tree. The headstone is simple, grey granite worn smooth by time and weather, with ivy creeping up its edges like it's trying to shield the name etched there from prying eyes. Jimmy kneels every single day, brushing away dirt or snow with a tenderness that seems out of place for a man so rough around the edges. He lays the flowers down, adjusts them just so, and then sits there for a spell, staring at the stone as if he's waiting for it to speak back. Sometimes his lips move, murmuring words too quiet for the wind to carry. Other times, he just sits in silence, the lines on his face deepening like the cracks in the earth beneath him. Folks in the small town of Millhaven have their theories about Jimmy. Some say he's mourning a wife taken too soon, maybe from cancer or a car wreck on the icy backroads during a brutal upstate winter. Others whisper he lost a child, a tragedy so profound it broke something fundamental inside him. At the local diner, where the waitresses pour endless cups of black coffee and the jukebox plays old Johnny Cash tunes, old-timers swap stories over stacks of pancakes drizzled with real maple syrup. "Saw him during NAM," one grizzled vet mutters, tapping his fork against the counter. "Came back different. Man's got ghosts following him, mark my words." And it's true. There's a haunted look about Jimmy, a shadow that lingers even on the sunniest days when kids fly kites in the park or families set up barbecues by the river. It's in the way his hands sometimes shake when he reaches for a doorknob, or how he flinches at the sound of a firecracker on the 4th of July, his eyes darting like he's back in some far-off jungle, hearing gunfire instead of celebration. Jimmy's life, if you can call it that, follows a rhythm as predictable as the church bells that ring out over Millhaven every Sunday morning. He wakes before dawn, in his modest trailer on the edge of town, a rusted single-wide parked near the abandoned sawmill where he used to work before his hands gave out and his mind started wandering. The inside smells of stale coffee and motor oil, with faded photographs tacked to the wood-paneled walls, snapshots of a younger Jimmy, grinning alongside buddies in army fatigues, or standing proud at a county fair with a ribbon for best pumpkin. But one frame sits empty on the shelf, the glass cracked as if it was thrown against a wall in a moment of rage or despair. He doesn't talk about it. He just brews a pot of Folgers on his dented stovetop, gulps it down black and bitter, and heads out to the cemetery with his flowers, as if that's the only thing tethering him to the land of the living. After, he might stop by the hardware store to pick up nails or a can of paint he doesn't need, just to have a reason, to nod at someone, to pretend he's still part of the town's heartbeat. But most days, he's back at the trailer by noon, sitting on a sagging lawn chair under a tarp awning, nursing a can of Budweiser and staring at the distant outline of the Catskill Mountains. The radio crackles with static, playing snippets of talk shows or classic rock, but Jimmy doesn't seem to hear it. His mind is elsewhere, caught in a loop of memory and regret, replaying moments he can't change. There's a quiet strength to him, though, a stubbornness that keeps him going even when it's clear he's running on fumes. He mows his tiny patch of lawn with a pushmower older than half the town, refusing help from neighbors who offer to lend a hand. He still stacks firewood for the winter, splitting logs with an axe until his shoulders ache, as if the physical pain is a welcome distraction from the ache inside. But there are signs, subtle but telling, that Jimmy's not just grieving, he's haunted. The way he'll stop dead in his tracks if he hears a helicopter overhead, his breath hitching like he's waiting for an explosion. The way he avoids the town's Memorial Day parade, where veterans march in crisp uniforms and the high school band plays the Star-Spangled Banner, because the sight of those flags waving in the breeze makes his chest tighten with something he can't name. And then there's the small, worn-out dog tag he keeps in his pocket, fingering it absent-mindedly when he thinks no one's watching. A relic of a war he survived, but at a cost he's still paying. It's a chilly Tuesday morning, one of those days when the mist hangs low over the Hudson, and the cemetery feels like it's caught between worlds, when Jimmy's routine is shattered by the unexpected. He's there as always, kneeling by the grave with a fresh bundle of daisies, his cap pulled low against the biting wind. The cemetery is quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant caw of a crow perched on a crooked headstone. He's murmuring again, his voice rough as gravel, when a small shadow falls across the grass beside him. Startled, Jimmy turns his head, his hand instinctively tightening around the flowers as if to protect them from an intruder. Standing there, no more than a few feet away, is a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, bundled in a puffy pink coat with mismatched mittens. Her curly hair spills out from under a knitted hat, and her wide, curious eyes are fixed on the headstone with an innocence that cuts through the heavy air. She clutches a tiny stuffed rabbit, its ears frayed from years of love, and tilts her head, as if she's trying to solve a puzzle. Jimmy freezes, his breath catching in his throat. He's not used to company here, not used to anyone stepping into this sacred, solitary space he's carved out for himself. The girl doesn't seem to notice his discomfort. She takes a cautious step closer, scuffing her sneakers in the dew-soaked grass, and points at the headstone with a mitten-covered finger. "Mister," she says, her voice small but clear, cutting through the silence like a bell. "Who's buried here? What's the name on the stone?" The question hangs in the air, simple yet sharp, piercing through years of carefully built walls. Jimmy's face pales, his jaw tightening as if he's been slapped. His hand, the one still clutching the dog tag in his pocket, twitches, and for a moment it looks like he might stand and walk away without a word. But something in the girl's earnest gaze, something so pure, so devoid of judgment, holds him in place. He opens his mouth, then closes it again, struggling to find words that have been buried deeper than the person under that stone. And then, in a voice so low it's almost carried away by the wind, he whispers a name that hasn't passed his lips in decades, a name tied to a pain so raw it threatens to unravel him right there on the frozen ground. The little girl's eyes widen, not because of the name itself, but because of the way Jimmy's voice breaks when he says it, like a dam giving way after years of holding back a flood. Jimmy Carter sat frozen on the cold, damp grass of Willowbrook Cemetery, the name he'd just whispered, still hanging in the air like a ghost. His voice, cracked and raw, seemed to echo in his own ears, a sound so unfamiliar it might as well have come from someone else. His hands, one clutching the crumpled bouquet of daisies and the other buried in his jacket pocket, gripping that worn-out dog tag, trembled as if the weight of that name had physically struck him. The little girl in the puffy pink coat stood there, her innocent eyes searching his face for something she couldn't possibly understand. A gust of November wind swept through the ancient oak above them, sending brittle leaves spiraling down like fragments of a shattered memory, and Jimmy felt the cold bite into his bones. Not just the chill of upstate New York, but something deeper, something that had been festering in his chest for decades. His breath came in short, shallow bursts, and for a moment he thought he might collapse right there, his body giving out under the strain of a pain he'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. "Why do you look so sad, mister?" the little girl asked, her voice soft but piercing, each word like a pebble dropped into still water, sending ripples through the silence. Jimmy's gaze darted to her, then back to the headstone, as if he could hide from the question by staring at the ivy-covered granite. Sad didn't even begin to cover it. Sad was for scraped knees or a lost pet. What he felt was something else entirely, a gnawing, relentless emptiness, threaded with guilt so thick it felt like chains wrapped around his heart. He wanted to stand, to walk away from this child and her questions, to retreat back to the solitude of his trailer and the comforting numbness of a can of Budweiser. But his knees wouldn't move. His body betrayed him, rooted to the spot as if the ground itself demanded he face this moment. I ain't sad," he lied, his voice rough as sandpaper, barely audible over the rustling leaves. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself, but the tremor in his hands gave him away. "Just thinking about old times, that's all." The girl tilted her head, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter, her mitten-covered fingers brushing over its frayed ears. She didn't buy it. Even at her age, she could sense the weight behind his words, the way they buckled under a truth he wasn't ready to share. "Old times with who?" she pressed, stepping closer, her sneakers squishing in the dew-soaked grass. Jimmy flinched at the question, his jaw tightening until it ached. He wanted to snap, to tell her to run along and leave him be, but the earnestness in her wide eyes stopped him cold. She wasn't prying to hurt him. She was just a kid, curious and unafraid, asking the kind of question adults in Millhaven had learned to avoid. And maybe that was why it cut so deep, because she didn't know better than to poke at a wound that had never healed. He turned his gaze back to the headstone, tracing the letters etched there with his mind's eye, letters he'd read 1,000 times over the years. "Someone I knew a long time ago," he muttered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "Someone who didn't deserve what happened." His voice broke on the last word, and he quickly looked down at the daisies in his lap, busying himself with adjusting the twine around them. Anything to avoid meeting the girl's eyes. But inside, his mind was a storm, memories flashing like lightning strikes, jungle heat, the deafening roar of helicopters, the metallic tang of blood in the air, and a voice laughing, promising they'd make it out together. A promise broken. Guilt clawed at him, sharper now than it had been in years, because saying that name aloud had torn open a scar he'd spent decades trying to ignore. He'd failed. He'd failed then, and he was failing now, unable to even answer a child's innocent question without crumbling. The little girl crouched down beside him, mimicking the way he knelt by the grave, her pink coat bunching up around her. "My grandma says when people go away, they're still watching us." "Is that true?" she asked, her voice hopeful, searching for reassurance. Jimmy's throat tightened, a lump forming that he couldn't swallow down. He wanted to believe that, wanted to think there was some kind of peace on the other side, some kind of forgiveness. But all he could feel was the weight of his own failures, the weight of silence from a grave that never answered back. "I don't know, kid," he rasped, his eyes still fixed on the flowers. "I hope so. But I I don't know. A shadow loomed nearby, and Jimmy glanced up to see a woman in her 30s, bundled in a scarf and jeans, hurrying across the cemetery path. Her face was flushed with worry, her breath puffing out in little clouds in the cold air. "Ellie! Honey, I told you not to wander off," she called, her tone a mix of relief and exasperation as she reached them. She looked at Jimmy, her expression shifting to apology. "I'm so sorry if she bothered you. She's just curious, always asking questions." Jimmy shook his head, forcing a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's fine. She ain't bothering me." But the woman's gaze lingered, taking in his hunched posture, the flowers, the way his hands shook as he set them down on the grave. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, the kind that came from living in a small town like Millhaven, where everyone knew everyone else's ghosts, even if they didn't speak of them. "Come on, Ellie," she said softly, holding out a hand to the girl. "Let's let the nice man have some peace." Ellie hesitated, looking back at Jimmy with a frown, but eventually took her mother's hand and stood. As they started to walk away, the girl turned over her shoulder and waved her stuffed rabbit at him. "Bye, mister. I hope your friend watches you too." Those words hit Jimmy like a punch to the gut. He watched them disappear down the winding path, the little girl's pink coat a bright spot against the gray of the cemetery, until they were out of sight. But the weight in his chest didn't lift. If anything, it grew heavier, pressing down until he could barely breathe. He turned back to the headstone, his fingers brushing over the dog tag in his pocket, the metal cold against his skin. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm so damn sorry." But the stone stayed silent, as it always did, offering no absolution, no relief. Just the cold, hard truth of a name etched in granite, a name that tied him to a moment in time he couldn't escape, no matter how many flowers he brought, no matter how many years passed. That night, back in his rusted trailer on the edge of town, Jimmy sat in his sagging lawn chair under the tarp awning, a half-empty can of Budweiser in his hand. The radio crackled faintly with static, some late-night talk show host droning on about nothing. But Jimmy wasn't listening. His mind was still at the cemetery, replaying the little girl's question over and over like a broken record. "Who's buried here? What's the name on the stone?" He'd said it, after all these years of silence, and now he couldn't unsay it. It was out there, real again, and with it came a flood of memories he'd fought so hard to keep buried. The smell of gunpowder, the weight of a rifle in his hands, the sound of a buddy's voice cutting off mid-sentence in a way that still haunted his dreams. His free hand went to the dog tag in his pocket again, a reflex now, and he pulled it out, staring at the stamped letters under the dim glow of a flickering porch light. Not his name, not his tag. But he'd carried it all these years, a burden he couldn't put down, a reminder of a debt he could never repay. He set the beer down on the splintered folding table beside him and stood, wincing as his bad knee protested the movement. Inside the trailer, the air was stale, smelling of old coffee grounds and the faint must of damp wood. He crossed to the shelf where the photographs hung, his eyes skipping over the faded snapshots of better days until they landed on the empty, cracked frame. He reached for it, his calloused fingers brushing over the broken glass, and for a moment he considered throwing it across the room again, letting it shatter completely this time. But he didn't. Instead, he opened a drawer in the rickety table beneath the shelf and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and creased from being handled too many times. A letter, one he'd never sent, because there was no one left to send it to. He unfolded it with trembling hands, the ink faded but still legible, and read the first line silently to himself. "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I need you to know I tried." He couldn't read the rest. Not tonight. The words blurred as his vision swam, and he folded the letter back up, tucking it into his pocket alongside the dog tag. But the weight of it was too much. The past too close now, stirred up by a child's innocent question. He sank onto the edge of his creaking bed, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking with the kind of sobs he hadn't let himself feel in years. He'd survived the war, survived the jungles of Vietnam, but this quiet, unrelenting grief was a battle he didn't know how to fight. Every bouquet of daisies, every trip to that grave, had been his way of begging for forgiveness, but it was never enough. And now, with that name spoken aloud, the wound felt fresh again, raw and bleeding in a way that made him feel more exposed than he'd ever been, even under enemy fire. The next morning, Jimmy didn't go to the cemetery. For the first time in years, he couldn't bring himself to make the walk. Instead, he sat at his tiny kitchen table, a cup of black coffee growing cold in front of him, staring at the letter he'd left out overnight. The guilt was a living thing now, coiled tight around his ribs, squeezing until every breath hurt. He knew he couldn't keep running from it, couldn't keep pretending that laying flowers on a grave was enough to make amends. But what else could he do? He'd built his life, or what was left of it, around this ritual, this silent apology, and without it, he felt untethered, adrift in a sea of memories he didn't want to face. Around noon, there was a knock at the trailer door, sharp and insistent. Jimmy startled, nearly knocking over his coffee. No one came out here, not unless it was a neighbor needing help with a flat tire or a delivery guy who'd taken a wrong turn. He shuffled to the door, his boots heavy on the linoleum, and opened it to find Miss Clara, the cemetery caretaker, standing on the sagging porch steps. Her grey hair was tucked under a knit cap, and she held a small paper bag in her gloved hands, her face lined with concern. "Morning, Jimmy," she said, her voice gentle but firm, the kind of tone that didn't take no for an answer. "Noticed you weren't at Willowbrook today. Thought I'd check in. Brought some of my apple bread. Figured you might need a bite." Jimmy shifted uncomfortably, scratching the back of his neck. "I'm fine, Clara. Just overslept is all." It was a weak excuse, and they both knew it. Clara's sharp eyes took him in, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the slump of his shoulders, the way he couldn't meet her gaze. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, setting the bag on the counter and folding her arms. "You been coming to that cemetery every day for nigh on 20 years, Jimmy Carter. Ain't like you to miss a morning. Something's eating at you worse than usual. You want to talk about it?" He didn't. Not with her, not with anyone. But Clara had a way of seeing through people, a quiet persistence honed by years of tending to graves and comforting the grieving. She'd seen him at his lowest, after all, back when he'd first started coming to Willowbrook, when he'd sometimes sit by that grave until dusk with a bottle of bourbon hidden in his jacket. She'd never judged him, never pushed too hard, but she'd always been there, sweeping leaves or trimming ivy, a steady presence in a world that felt anything but. Now, though, her gaze was unwavering, and Jimmy felt the walls he'd built start to crumble under the weight of it. "A kid asked me about the name on the stone yesterday," he admitted finally, his voice low, almost lost in the hum of the ancient fridge in the corner. "Couldn't shake it off. Kept me up all night, thinking about things I ain't got no business thinking about anymore." Clara nodded slowly, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him, her hands folded on the table. "Kids got a way of cutting to the heart of things, don't they? No filter. Sometimes it's a blessing. Sometimes it's a curse. But maybe it's time, Jimmy. Time to stop carrying this alone." Her words hung heavy between them, and Jimmy felt a surge of anger, hot and sudden, rising in his chest. "You don't know what I'm carrying," he snapped, his voice sharper than he meant it to be. "You don't know what I did, what I didn't do. Ain't no amount of talking gonna fix it." Clara didn't flinch. She just leaned back slightly, her expression softening. "Maybe not. But keeping it locked up ain't fixing it either. I seen a lot of folks come through that cemetery, Jimmy. Seen 'em grieve, seen 'em heal. But you're stuck. Been stuck since I met you. And I don't think it's just about who's under that stone. It's about what you think you owe 'em." That struck too close to home. Jimmy stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to tell her to leave, to take her apple bread and her pity and go, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, he knew she was right. He was stuck in a loop of guilt and regret, replaying a moment from a war half a world away, a moment where he'd made a choice, or failed to make one, and it had cost everything. He turned away from Clara, staring at the cracked window above the sink, where the distant outline of the Catskill Mountains loomed like a silent judge. "I can't let it go," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how. Every time I try, it's like I'm betraying him all over again." Clara stood too, but she didn't move toward him. She just waited, giving him space to wrestle with whatever demons were tearing him up inside. After a long, heavy silence, she spoke again, her tone gentle but firm. "There's a box in my shed at the cemetery. Been there a long time, since before I even started working there. Has your name on it. Someone left it for you, years back. I never opened it, figured it wasn't my place. But I think you ought to come see what's inside. Might be something you need, even if it hurts to look." Jimmy turned slowly, his brow furrowing. A box? With his name on it? The thought sent a chill down his spine, a mix of dread and curiosity twisting in his gut. He didn't want to know, didn't want to face whatever was waiting for him. But Clara's words from earlier echoed in his head. It's time to stop carrying this alone. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd been hiding from the truth long enough. He nodded once, a barely perceptible movement, but it was enough. "All right," he muttered. "I'll come by tomorrow, see what's in that damn box." That night, sleep didn't come. Jimmy lay on his narrow bed, the springs creaking under his weight, staring at the stained ceiling as the wind howled outside. The letter in his pocket felt like a stone, pressing against him, and the thought of that box at the cemetery gnawed at his mind. What could it be? A message? A relic? Something worse? Every possibility brought a fresh wave of fear, because whatever it was, it would force him to confront the past head-on. No more flowers or quiet apologies to shield him. He thought of the little girl, Ellie, and her simple, cutting questions. He thought of Clara, her steady gaze that saw too much. And he thought of the name on that headstone, a name that had defined his life for decades, a name tied to a debt he wasn't sure he could ever pay. The next day, as the sun rose over the Hudson Valley, painting the world in shades of pale gold, Jimmy made his way back to Willowbrook Cemetery. His steps were heavier than usual, each one a battle against the instinct to turn back. Clara was waiting for him by the caretaker's shed, a small, weathered structure near the cemetery's edge, its paint peeling like old skin. She didn't say much, just handed him a rusted key and nodded toward the door. "It's on the shelf in the back. Tin box. Got your name scratched on the lid. I'll be sweeping the paths if you need me." Then she walked away, giving him privacy he wasn't sure he wanted. Inside the shed, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and old tools. Jimmy's hands shook as he fumbled with the key, his bad knee throbbing as he stepped over a pile of rakes to reach the shelf. There it was, a small, dented tin box, no bigger than a cigar case, with J. Carter etched crudely into the lid. His heart pounded as he lifted it down, the metal cold and heavy in his hands. He set it on a workbench, staring at it like it might bite him, every nerve in his body screaming at him to walk away. But he couldn't. Not now. Not after Ellie's question, not after Clara's words, not after years of carrying this weight alone. He pried the lid open with a creak, the sound too loud in the quiet shed. Inside was a folded photograph, its edges frayed, and a small tarnished medal, a purple heart, not his own. His breath caught as he unfolded the photo, revealing two young soldiers grinning at the camera, their arms slung around each other's shoulders, mud on their boots and sweat on their brows. One was Jimmy, barely recognizable with a face unlined by grief. The other was the man whose name was on that headstone, the man whose laughter still echoed in Jimmy's nightmares. On the back of the photo, in a handwriting he hadn't seen in decades, was a single line: "You did what you could, Jim. Let it go." Jimmy's legs gave out and he sank onto a stool, the photo trembling in his hands. Tears burned in his eyes, spilling over before he could stop them, and a sob tore from his chest, raw and ragged. He hadn't done enough. He'd never believed he had. But here was proof. Proof that someone else thought differently, someone who mattered more than anyone. The medal, the photo, the words, they were a lifeline, but they were also a blade, cutting deeper into wounds he'd thought couldn't hurt anymore. He clutched the photo to his chest, his shoulders heaving, as years of suppressed grief poured out in the dim light of that shed. When the tears finally slowed, Jimmy sat there, hollowed out, but still burning with questions. Who had left this box? How long had it been waiting? And why now, after all these years, did it feel like the past was demanding to be reckoned with? He knew he couldn't ignore it anymore. The ritual of the flowers, the silence, the solitude, it wasn't working. It never had. He had to do something, had to face what he'd been running from, even if it broke him completely. Wiping his face with the sleeve of his faded flannel jacket, he tucked the photo and medal into his pocket, alongside the dog tag and the letter, a collection of ghosts that refused to stay buried. He stepped outside, the cold air hitting him like a slap, and saw Clara in the distance, sweeping leaves near the oak tree by the grave. She glanced up, her expression unreadable, but there was a quiet strength in the way she nodded at him, as if she knew he'd found what he needed, even if it hurt. Jimmy took a deep breath, the kind that felt like it might be his last, and made his way down the path, not to the grave this time, but past it, toward the edge of the cemetery, where the Hudson River glimmered in the distance, a wide, endless ribbon of water that had seen centuries of pain and renewal. It was an emblem of resilience in this part of America, a silent witness to the struggles of those who lived along its banks. And now it seemed to call to him, urging him to decide. He stopped at the fence line, looking out over the river, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He could keep going as he had, bringing flowers, whispering apologies to a stone that couldn't hear him. Or he could do what he'd been too afraid to do for decades. He could go back to where it all began, to the place where the guilt was born, and face the truth of what happened. There was a VA hospital not far from here, just a few towns over, where some of the old crew from his unit still gathered, swapping stories of days they'd rather forget. He'd avoided it for years, afraid of the memories, afraid of the judgment. But now, with the photo burning a hole in his pocket and a child's question echoing in his mind, he knew he had to go. He had to ask if anyone else remembered, if anyone else carried the same ghosts, if anyone else could help him make sense of the forgiveness scrawled on the back of that picture. As he turned back toward the cemetery gate, his resolve hardened, though his heart still ached with a pain that might never fade. This wasn't about forgetting. It wasn't even about healing, not fully. It was about owning what he'd done, or hadn't done, and finding a way to live with it, even if it meant walking straight into the fire of his past. And hey, if you're feeling this story as much as I am, hit that subscribe button. There's more to come, and you won't want to miss how Jimmy's journey unfolds. Jimmy knew this choice could shatter what little peace he'd clung to, but he also knew he didn't have a choice anymore. The box had been opened, the name had been spoken, and the ghosts were out, demanding to be seen. With one last glance at the grave under the oak, he whispered, "I'm gonna try. For you, I'm gonna try." Then he started walking, his boots crunching on the frost-kissed gravel, toward a reckoning he wasn't sure he'd survive, but one he had to face, no matter the cost. Jimmy Carter took the long way to the VA hospital just outside Poughkeepsie, his rusted pickup truck rattling over the uneven back roads of upstate New York. The Hudson Valley stretched out beside him, a canvas of muted November greys and fading autumn golds. But his eyes stayed locked on the asphalt ahead, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles whitened. The tin box from Clara's shed sat on the passenger seat, the Purple Heart and the photograph tucked inside, their weight heavier than the metal itself. Every few miles he'd glance at it, half expecting it to vanish, half wishing it would. The decision to go to the hospital, to face the men who might remember that day in the jungle, the day etched into the name on the headstone, had ignited a firestorm in his chest. Dread coiled tight around his ribs, each breath a struggle against the panic threatening to swamp him. What if they blamed him, just as he'd blamed himself all these years? What if they looked into his eyes and saw the failure he'd carried since Vietnam, the failure he'd whispered to a grave every morning with a bundle of daisies? The closer he got, the louder the memories roared, choppers slicing through humid air, mud sucking at his boots, a scream cut short by an explosion that still echoed in his nightmares. His bad knee throbbed with every press of the gas pedal, a cruel reminder of the shrapnel he'd taken that day, a wound that had healed on the outside while the deeper one festered. By the time he pulled into the hospital lot, gravel crunching under his tires, his shirt was damp with sweat despite the chill, and his hands shook so badly he could barely turn off the engine. This was it. No more running, no more hiding behind flowers and silence. But God help him, he wasn't sure he could step out of that truck and face what waited inside. The hospital loomed ahead, a squat, brick building with peeling paint and rows of narrow windows, the kind of place that looked more like a forgotten warehouse than a haven for healing. Veterans shuffled in and out, some on crutches, others with ball caps pulled low over haunted eyes, all carrying the invisible scars of wars fought decades ago. Jimmy sat frozen in the driver's seat, the tin box now in his lap, his thumb brushing over the scratched J. Carter on the lid. His mind raced with excuses to leave, trucks low on gas, got chores waiting at the trailer, don't even know if anyone's still here who'd remember. But then he felt the crinkle of the photograph in his pocket, the scrawled words on the back burning into him. "You did what you could, Jim. Let it go." Those words weren't just a memory. They were a command, a plea from a ghost he couldn't ignore anymore. And that little girl's voice, Ellie's, echoed too, her innocent question about the name on the stone, cutting through years of numbness. He couldn't keep burying this. Not for himself, not for anyone. With a ragged breath that felt like it might crack his chest open, he pushed the truck door open and stepped out, the cold November air biting into his skin as his boots hit the ground. Each step toward the entrance felt like wading through quicksand, the hospital doors growing larger, more menacing, until he was inside, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the murmur of voices hitting him like a wave. He clutched the tin box tighter, a lifeline in a sea of fear, and shuffled toward the reception desk, his voice barely a rasp as he asked if any guys from the 1st Infantry, NAM 69, still came around. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, pointed him to a rec room down the hall, where old-timers sometimes gathered over weak coffee and stronger stories. Every step down that hallway ratcheted the tension higher, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He could turn back, he could still run, but he didn't. Not this time. The rec room was a drab space, with mismatched chairs and a flickering TV mounted in the corner, playing a muted football game no one watched. A handful of men sat scattered around, some staring into space, others hunched over styrofoam cups, their faces etched with the same weariness Jimmy saw in his own mirror. The air smelled of burnt coffee and cigarette smoke that clung to clothes long after the last drag. He stood in the doorway, unseen for a moment, scanning the room for a familiar face, for someone who might carry the same ghosts. His gaze landed on a wiry man in a faded army jacket, his silver hair cropped close, sitting alone at a small table near the window. Something about the way he held himself, the sharp angle of his jaw, tugged at a memory buried deep. Then the man turned, catching Jimmy's stare, and his weathered face shifted, first surprise, then recognition, then something darker, something raw. "Carter," the man said, his voice rough from years of smoking, standing slowly as if testing whether Jimmy was real. "Jimmy Carter? That really you?" Jimmy nodded, unable to speak, his throat closed tight as the man crossed the room with a slight limp. Up close he knew him, Ray Henshaw, point man on their squad, the guy who'd always cracked jokes to keep them sane in the jungle until that day when no joke could save them. Ray's eyes, still sharp despite the years, searched Jimmy's face, and the weight of unspoken history hung heavy between them. "Been a long damn time, brother," Ray said, his voice softer now, but there was an edge to it, a question beneath the words. "Why are you here now, after all these years?" Jimmy felt the room closing in, the other men's curious glances prickling his skin, and he knew this was the moment. If he didn't speak now, he never would. Clutching the tin box like a shield, he forced the words out, jagged and halting. "I need to know, Ray. I need to know if you blame me for Danny, for what happened that day. 'Cause I ain't stopped blaming myself since." The name, Danny, the name on the headstone cut through the air, and Ray's face tightened, his breath hitching. The tension peaked, a silent scream in Jimmy's chest, as he waited for the verdict that might destroy him or save him or both. Ray didn't answer right away. He looked down at the floor, at the scuffed linoleum, his hands balling into fists at his sides. The silence stretched, agonizing, each second a blade twisting in Jimmy's gut. Around them, the other veterans shifted uncomfortably, sensing the gravity of the moment, some looking away to give them privacy in this crowded, broken space. Finally, Ray exhaled, a shuddering sound, and met Jimmy's eyes again, his own glistening with something unspoken. "Blame you," he said, his voice low, trembling with an emotion Jimmy couldn't name. "Hell, Jim, I blame myself for years. Thought if I'd moved faster, spotted that tripwire sooner, Danny'd still be here. We all got blood on our hands from that day, but you carried him out, man. Even after you took shrapnel, even when we were under fire. You didn't leave him behind. I saw it. We all saw it." His words landed like blows, each one shattering a piece of the guilt Jimmy had built his life around. Jimmy shook his head, tears burning hot in his eyes, his voice cracking as he spoke. "But I didn't save him, Ray. I got him to the chopper, but he was already gone. I promised him we'd make it out together. I broke that promise." Ray stepped closer, his hand resting heavy on Jimmy's shoulder, a gesture of brotherhood that cut through decades of distance. "You did everything you could, Jim. Danny knew it. I know it. Ain't a man in that squad who'd say different. You've been punishing yourself long enough. He wouldn't want that. He'd want you to live." Jimmy's knees buckled under the weight of those words, the absolution he'd never dared hope for, and Ray steadied him. Two old soldiers holding each other up in a room full of unspoken pain. The tears came then, silent but unrelenting, streaming down Jimmy's weathered face as he clutched the tin box tighter, the photograph's message echoing in his mind. Let it go. For the first time in decades, he felt the chains of guilt loosen, just a fraction, but enough to breathe a little deeper, to feel a flicker of something like release. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it was a start, a raw, messy, painful start to something he wasn't sure he deserved, but couldn't refuse anymore. In the weeks that followed, Jimmy wasn't the same man who'd trudged to Willowbrook Cemetery every dawn with a bouquet of daisies. The change wasn't sudden or miraculous. It was slow, deliberate, like the turning of seasons in the Hudson Valley. He still woke before the sun, the habit too ingrained to break. But now, instead of heading straight to the grave, he'd sit at his tiny kitchen table, sipping bitter Folgers, staring at the letter he'd never sent, and the photograph Ray had confirmed was left by another squad mate years ago, a quiet gesture of solidarity Jimmy hadn't known about until now. He started going to the VA hospital more often, not just for the rec room talks with Ray and a few others who remembered Danny, but for the group sessions he'd always scoffed at before. Sitting in those hard plastic chairs, surrounded by men and women who carried their own wars, he found himself speaking, haltingly at first, then with a rawness that surprised even himself, about the jungle, the explosion, the promises broken, and burdens carried. Each word felt like peeling back a layer of scar tissue, painful but necessary, and though the guilt didn't vanish, it grew quieter, less suffocating. He even started helping out around Millhaven, fixing fences for neighbors or stacking firewood for Miss Clara, small acts that tethered him to the living in a way he hadn't allowed since coming home from Nam. But the biggest shift came in what he gave up, a sacrifice born of that moment of truth with Ray. He stopped buying daisies every day. Not because he'd forgotten Danny, not because he'd stopped caring, but because he understood now that flowers couldn't pay a debt that wasn't his to pay alone. It was a renunciation of the ritual that had kept him trapped, a symbolic letting go of the need to apologize every sunrise. The first morning he didn't go to the cemetery. He stood outside his trailer, hands empty, watching the dawn paint the Catskills in hues of amber, and wept, not with despair, but with the ache of release, knowing he was finally trying to honor Danny by living, not just grieving. One crisp December morning, weeks after that reckoning in the VA hospital, Jimmy returned to Willowbrook Cemetery, not with flowers, but with something else. He walked the familiar dirt path, his old work boots crunching against the frost-hardened ground, the ancient oak looming overhead with branches bare against a pale sky. In his pocket was the tin box, lighter now without the weight of unshared pain, and in his hand he carried Danny's purple heart, the tarnished metal catching the weak sunlight. He knelt by the grave, the headstone still weathered, the name still a punch to his heart. But this time, he didn't whisper an apology. Instead, he placed the medal gently on the granite, his calloused fingers lingering for a moment, as if saying goodbye to more than just a piece of metal. It was a final offering, not of guilt, but of remembrance, a promise kept in a different way, a vow to carry Danny's memory without letting it crush him. He stood slowly, his bad knee protesting, and took a step back, his breath fogging in the cold air as he looked at the grave one last time. Beside the headstone, a small figure caught his eye, Ellie, the little girl in the puffy pink coat, standing a few yards away with her mother, holding that same frayed, stuffed rabbit. She waved at him, shy but bright, and Jimmy managed a small, genuine smile, the first in longer than he could remember. In her tiny hand, tucked against the rabbit, was a single daisy, likely picked from the roadside, a quiet echo of the offerings he'd once made. It was a poignant mirror of his own journey, a child's innocent gesture of care, standing beside the weight of a soldier's sacrifice, a reminder that even in the shadow of loss, there's room for tenderness to bloom. As Jimmy turned to leave, his boots scuffing the frozen grass, he felt the river's presence beyond the cemetery fence, the Hudson flowing steady and unyielding, a witness to countless stories of pain and renewal. It struck him then, as the pale sun climbed higher, that time doesn't erase wounds. It carves them deeper into the earth of who we are. War steals more than lives. It steals pieces of the living, leaving behind fragments to be pieced together over years, over lifetimes. But healing, when it comes, isn't loud or triumphant. It's quiet, like the river's current, persistent even when unseen, carrying away the sharpest edges of grief if you let it. Jimmy wasn't whole, maybe he'd never be, but he was moving forward one step at a time, toward a life not just defined by what he'd lost, but by what he could still give. And as he walked back to his truck, the wind carrying the faint scent of winter, he knew Danny's laughter, that ghost of a sound from a jungle long ago, would stay with him, not as a weight but as a light, guiding him through whatever lay ahead. Hey, if this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of someone who's carrying their own silent battles, drop a comment below saying, "I believe in second chances." Share this with someone who needs to hear it today, someone who might need a reminder that healing, however slow, is possible. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. There are more stories like Jimmy's waiting to be told, stories of heartbreak and hope that you won't want to miss.